Hello and welcome to the International Postdoc Forum for the Philosophy of Science. My name is Alan Love. I'm the director of the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science, and it's my privilege and honor to host the event today. Just a few words as we begin about the Postdoc Forum. It began in the midst of the COVID pandemic, when there were lost opportunities, especially for more junior scholars to be able to travel to conferences and present their research. And we thought it might be an interesting idea to be able to have that in the virtual format. And the format was so successful that we decided to continue to do it going forward. And we're now entering our almost fourth year of the program, which showcases virtual research presentations from international scholars with commentaries from local Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science community members. So today, we will be having a presentation by Pedro Bravo, grouping approaches to PFAS and industry funding, a case study on the findings of a recent panel of experts, and that will be followed by a commentary from Corey DeChier, who is a postdoc here in the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. And as we get started, I'm very excited to announce that Pedro is literally giving the last possible postdoc talk he can, because he was recently able to secure a permanent position in Brazil, and we are excited for him and glad that he can join us to give this one last postdoc talk. So Pedro, please take the floor. It's yours.
Thank you, Alan, for introducing me. Thanks, Janet and Corey, for accepting to be the commentator. And thank you all for your patience regarding the schedule. We had to do some changes, first because of COVID, and then this position that I got. Actually, today I did the medical exam, so I was like in this rush and doing the bureaucracy to get this position. But let's go to what is important. So I'm going to talk about a recent panel of experts that had to do with grouping approach to PFAS. And my objective is to show how they were co-opted in a way that favors industry positions, fluorine industry at least. So in order to do that, I will present my theoretical background. I'm just gonna talk as quickly as I can, about PFAS and its grouping approach, to finally move to my case study. So I will give some comments about the entities at play, who funded, some general commentaries, and then I will provide my analysis before concluding, okay? So I think it's important to say, when talking about industry funded, I think it's important to highlight how it's not only phenomenal in the global north. So even if the numbers of the percentage of industry funding in the US, in Europe, the European Union at least, are high, and in South America at least, they are not so high. Even so, there are impacts here. So it's a global phenomenon that has impact in science almost everywhere. So Manuela Fernandes Pinto has this really nice chapter where she discussed that. So she states that, for instance, subjects for clinical trials in Latin America, they're hired to participate at some clinical trials, and sometimes they don't have the necessary knowledge to give an informed consent and this kind of thing. So it's a phenomenon that impacts also the global South. So I think it's important to highlight that in the beginning. And well, I guess the literature on industry-funded research has negative consequence of it. Bennett Holman and Kevin Elliott, they have this really nice paper listing the positive and bad consequence. And I just want to give a quick overview in case you are not familiar with this literature. So one of the benefits is that with industry funding, we have more money to do research, right? So a lot of countries are struggling with money to fund science. So industry funded research can help that. It can help to turn practical applications into patents. Thorsten Vierholt has a really nice paper where he presents this concept of design rules, which are some regularities that guide the design of a practical applications. And he defends that industry-funded research provides this kind of knowledge. So it's a different sort of knowledge that is generated in this kind of research. Some authors state that industry-funded research can help the reproducibility crisis because they're supposed to follow more guidelines, international guidelines. And there are also cases where there is innovations in what we would call basic research. So not only applied research, some case at IBM, for example. But so the literature has that one can present. So maybe the most well-known is the funding effect. This is the systematic tendency of industry-funded studies to lead to favorable outcomes. And this has been shown to be the case in various areas of research, especially biomedicine, but also nutrition science, agriculture, and so on. Industry-funded research can also impact the questions and themes that are investigated. So, of course, some themes that are not so profitable will not be investigated. And this has some really bad consequence for the study of disease, for example. Rare disease, tropical disease are understudied. And also some lines of research can be forbidden. So recently here in Brazil, congressman affiliated with the meat industry, he proposed a law trying to forbid the research on lab meat, meat created artificially, because it would impact the industry of meat in Brazil. And the meat industry here is responsible for a large part of our GPD. So that was his arguments. I think in the US, the National Rifle Association did something like that, also trying to forbid research on gun violence. These talks are not publication bias, so only positive results are published, negative studies are not published. So the literature may be misguided by the papers that are published. It can also impact scientific concepts and categories. So there is the phenomenon of disease mongering, the creation of or the extension of some disease in order to justify the use of pharmaceutical. Impact on scientific norms, especially the norm of communism or communalism, and impact also on science education. So there have been some cases where industry tried to add some changes in textbooks for high school in order to be more friendly to them about plastics, dioxin, this kind of thing. And there is also the impact on scientific panels. So I really enjoyed this image from McGarrett and Wagner. So they show how industry can impact all stages of science, the way research is conducted, interpreted, journal peer review, and also expert panel opinions. So a scientific panel can be created in order to generate consensus statements about a subject, especially a policy relevant subject. It's harder to criticize because it's not only one scientist talking about a subject, it's a group of scientists. So it has like yeah, social credibility in the media and for the public. So it's really yeah, a nice element, an interesting element of science and industry, as also trying to impact scientific panels, either by putting there someone affiliated with industry or creating their own panels. Okay, so the case study that we are going to discuss is a case where a scientific panel was co-opted. Well, but in order to do this kind of impact, you need to have a lot of resources. So I think it's helpful to have in mind that it's not all industry that can impact science negatively, you know. So Kevin Elliott has this paper where he proposed 3 conditions under which industry funding is most likely to impact science in a negative way. And I think these conditions are really helpful because they allow one to zoom in the cases where it's more likely to have an industry with resources to impact science in the conditions that scientific findings are not yet stabilized. There is too much uncertainty yet. So there's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of consensus about the theme. And the second condition states that agents have strong incentives, economic incentives, political incentives, to influence the scientific findings, you know, in ways that damage the credibility of the research. So if a company has a lot of profit because of a chemical product, it will have an economic incentive to damage the research that states that this product is harmful or something like that. And finally, agents that satisfy the second conditions also have adequate opportunities. They have the opportunities, the means to influence those scientific findings. They have resources to hire companies who will do friendly research or to create their own panels, this kind of thing. So when talking about PFAS, I will try to show that PFAS research satisfy these 3 conditions. Okay. Well, so far about industry funded research, and now moving to PFAS. I don't know whether you are familiar with per and polyfluoroalkyl substance. There are a large class of synthetic chemicals that allow a wide range of industrial applications. I will mention some of them later, but also make them highly persistent in the environment. And some of them, which are more studied, are toxic, and one of them, at least PFOA, was linked to there's one study who linked PFOA to a lot of health outcomes as testicular cancer, kidney cancer, colitis, thyroid disease, and some other health outcomes. More recently, it has been also related to problems within the immunological system. So I will just present some images now to give an overview of PFAS. So this paper by Grigian and Clapp, they present the history of PFAS. So here you have the production at 3M in Minnesota. And they, in the 60s and 70s, there were some internal studies already showing some results, but which weren't published. Okay, the documents showing these studies only came into public after a legal prosecution in the 90s. The Tennant family, did a lawsuit, generated a lot of documents, and that's how we know today that they didn't publish important studies showing some harmful effects of PFAS. And well, in the beginning of the century, at least PFOA and PFOS, which are the 2 most studied, they have been added to the Stockholm Convention of Organic Pollutants. I guess that's the name. But there's also some exceptions. So in Brazil, for example, until today, there is an exception allowing one pesticide that is based on PFOA. So in some place, things continue to be the same. Things are not so linear, especially international regulations and so on. And I know this image is not so easy to see, but I think it's really important to have like an overview of PFAS. So here we have PFAS according to one of the definitions, like any numbers of atoms of carbon and 2n+1 of fluorine, and then a structure. We have here the subclasses. And well, this paper is from 2017, but I think it's really nice to see to note the difference between the number of peer-reviewed articles about each of the PFAS. So PFOA has a number of. So there was more than 4,000 papers by 2017. PFOS, more than 3,000 papers. But newer PFAS with less carbons, which industry has been saying that are less harmful, are not so studied. So one of the substitutes of PFOS, I guess, GeneX, you see the difference of the number of papers, only 26. Another PFBPA, only 3 by 2017. So there is this huge difference of of the evidence that we have about each of the PFAS, okay? And just to give like another other image to present the situation of PFAS occurrence in the world. So here we have the Forever Pollution Project, shows the contamination in Europe. The Northeastern PFAS Project Lab has some really nice information about the occurrence of PFAS in the US. And me and Daniele, with a Brazilian chemistry as well, at Notre Dame University, we are trying to create a map of the occurrence of PFAS in Brazil, because there is really just a few studies about it. It's so understudied. The occurrence of PFAS worldwide. So PFAS satisfies Elliott's condition. So first, there's not a consensus about definition of PFAS. Its extension can vary from 600 to more than 4,000 substances. So OECD definition covers more than 4,000 substances, but there are authors who defend a more precise definition, which only covers less than 1,000. Vast majority of PFAS are persistent. Some of them are highly persistent, but their toxicity may vary. For example, we have evidence about only a part of them. So the findings have not been stabilized about PFAS so far. There is a huge economic incentive in the second category. So more than 200 categories of use according to a paper for guitar strings, in firefighting foam, in Teflon till 2013, according to 3M websites, in food package, in a lot of products. And industry has also been have opportunities to influence this research. So Sharon Lerner, she has this really interesting series of investigative journalism at The Intercept. And one of her texts called Lawsuit Reveals How Paid Experts Help 3M Command the Science. Professor who received papers from regular journals, and he sent the papers to 3M staff in order, as he said. So my personal advice is that you want to keep bad papers out of the literature. Otherwise, in litigation situations, they can be a large obstacle to refute. There's also one email where he clearly brags about declining Worsom paper. I couldn't access the email. It's on the Attorney General website of Minnesota, I don't know it's whether I'm accessing from another country. I can send you the link later if you want to try to check it. But there's also this email, so how they are influencing the literature. Okay, so there is this whole situation about PFAS. Only some of them are well studied. Industry has been influenced the literature in a lot of ways. I just mentioned one example. Some of them are really toxic. They are linked with some really worrisome health outcomes. So what to do, how we will regulate, how to regulate this large amount of chemicals, okay? So one can approach this question by PFOS, PFOA, and then PFOS, and then another one. Or you can regulate a class or a group. You can regulate or assess those substances as a group. And then there are several grouping approaches. According to, well, first, some of the advantages of grouping approach is that it reduces the tendency to assume that chemicals with no data pose no risk. So it's connected to the idea of the precautionary principle, reversing the burden of proof, and also reducing regrettable substitutions. So substitutions that are somehow almost the same and will generate the same harmful effect. So regulating as a group can avoid that. And in the case of PFAS, there is this paper by Cousins and collaborators where they stated 9 grouping approach, which were ranked on a precautionary scale. Cousins proposed that this precautionary scale was based on the number of PFAS covered and data requirements. So the first approach, the P-sufficient approach, would cover almost all PFAS and does not require any data. The P-sufficient approach states that since the vast majority of PFAS are persistent, they should be regulated together. Just this property. And then there are some persistence by accumulation and mobility. And 6th position, we have the total organofluorine approach. So its basic idea of this approach is there's a way to measure the amount of fluorine in a sample. It can be extracted by 2 methods. I will mention them later. And then one can assume that the concentration of fluorine found is equal to the concentration of one of the most toxic PFAS, such as PFOA or PFAS. So it can help screening risk assessment, for example. And the least precautionary approach would be only grouping PFAS, which is a subclass of PFAS with the same adverse effects, modes, and mechanism of actions, and also toxicokinetics. So this one would cover just a few PFAS, maybe less than 10, because even PFO and PFOS may not have the same mode of action. The total organofluorine approach in some papers would cover more than 40, maybe 50, and P-sufficient, all of them, okay? Total organofluorine doesn't not require that much of data, and these are the approach to PFAS according to Cousins and collaborators in this paper. So I got in contact with this discussion because I was studying the precautionary principle. So I'm just mentioning here it's a moment of merchandise. And in case you're interested, we can discuss later the relationship with the precautionary principle of this paper, but I'm not mentioning this further. So let's go to the case study. So the material of my that I paper and wrote this paper called Grouping of PFAS for Human Health Risk Assessment, Findings from an Independent Panel of Experts. Notes that Cousins was present, De Witt, and some other authors that were present in the previous paper that I talked about. So it's really a combination of industry scientists and independent scientists. It was a journal called which is linked to Severe. I will talk about it in a minute. So what I think it's relevant in this by the American Chemistry Council, which is a trade association of chemical companies. And so she said some would dismiss the conclusions, yet the authors are quite diverse and include scientists who've raised concerns about the chemical. So when some colleagues looked at this paper, they were, maybe it's reliable because there is some independent science. There are indeed some independent science. So I think it's an interesting case, first because of it, and second, because the details about industry negative influence on scientific panels are hard to find. Yeah. So here's a quotation of McGarrett and Wagner's books stating that. So since this panel was done online, I could access all this supplement material. So it was like easier to find where they did some decisions were made to facilitate industry position or not. So that's why I think it's an interesting case. Okay, so talking about the paper itself, so far it has 14 citations according to Google Scholar. It had 11 experts and 1 topic expert lead. This topic expert lead was responsible for some round of questions. She proposed some questions via this application, this enterprise called Scipions. You can enter their websites. They do online panels about almost about everything. You can insert your email address there and receive their invitations to participate. So there were some rounds of questions and even some interactions about the scientists. After the answers, one could comment something, and it was done online. It was funded by the American Chemistry Council, as I said. So the American Chemistry Council, the ACC, funded this panel, but the experts didn't know that. How do I know this? It was stated in the paper that they didn't disclose the funding to the panel. Okay, just in the paper, you will find information that American Chemistry Council funded the exercise, but it was not known to the scientists who participated at the panel. And on a first reading of the material, there are already a lot of problems. So there is non-disclosure of conflicts of interest of some authors. They provided the information of ACC funding, and ACC is really known for some bad influence on science in case of plastics, in case of David Michaels in his The Triumph of Doubt too. So they mentioned that, but they did not disclose conflicts of interest of 3 authors. 2 of them are authors of Scipion. One of them worked for a company in Michigan. She worked for it, and this company was being prosecuted about some PFAS contamination in Michigan. And she published on the company's website a post downplaying the risks of PFAS. So she was known by that back then, some 5 years ago. There's a lack of transparency. So the supplement material talks a lot about some appendix, some annex, which are not there. There's no link to them. There are unclear questions. So the scientists, the experts, sometimes they mention, well, this question is so it's so unclear that I cannot answer it properly. So I don't know, give the score 10 to each approach to every approach you are presenting, this kind of thing. So these kinds of problems make it really hard to do an entire evaluation of the thesis. And here's one of the example. See, one of the scientists complaining about the question. So I do not interpret this question as focused on drinking water criteria. That actually would have made it much easier for me to answer. I would have limited the definition to those PFAS that have actually been measured in drinking water. If this was the focus for all questions, then the answers would also have been much easier. However, the background documents did not focus on drinking water, so that's why I did not interpret the questions have that narrow a focus. So they were really complaining from time to time about the questions and so on. So it's really hard to analyze all answers. So what I did is that I restricted myself to 2 theses that were commonly shared by Science press release about this paper, ACC website when they talked about this paper, and also Fluor Council, which is a kind of European ACC, okay? And what I tried to do is to do a textual analysis about those 2 theses and its reason both in the paper and the supplementary material. So the first thesis that I tried to investigate had to do about the P-sufficient approach. The first thesis stated that persistence alone is not sufficient for grouping PFAS for the purpose of assessing human health risk. So here we have like at least 3 problems. So the question was formulated in a different way than the way that the scientists formulated. I will explain later. There is a misleading quotation, and the format of the answers and aggregating terms are also problematic as well. So here, so in the round 2, at the final of the round 1 of questions, I guess, yeah, the final of round 1, each expert had the opportunity to formulate a question that would be answered by each expert at round 2. So expert 9 wrote this question. Here's the exact quote, okay? Is the P-sufficient approach a management option for PFAS that is feasible? And then in question, when this question appears at the second round, it appears in this way, so much bigger. So what's the scientific merits of using environmental persistence as a means to group PFAS? How could persistence be defined for any PFAS based on the broadest OECD definition that is not persistent? Would those then be excluded from further evaluation? So I think this by itself showed that the question was complicated in so many ways. So they used the broadest definition that they had. But also what I think is interesting is the change from feasibility to scientific merits. So as David DeMichael say, it's always easier to discuss, to debate and create doubt about the science and not the politics, right? So here I will depart just a little about what I wrote in the paper. So I think that the change to scientific merit, one can plausibly argue that the change to scientific merit allows more space to criticize the P-sufficient approach, since it's the least data-intensive approach. So since there are obviously differences across PFAS, so it's really easy to discuss. But no, the toxicity is different, kind of thing. While discussions about feasibility would take to regulations by essential and non-essential use. So that's the proposition of people who defend the P-sufficient approach as cousins. And this kind of regulation was endorsed by this authoritative consensus statement called the Madrid Statement on PFAS. And also to see how changes in the paper were made in a way that favors data-intensive approach instead of less data-intensive. Note how another question was reframed. So This I noticed this a week ago, like reading one more time the material. So expert 5 wrote this question: to what extent should an understanding of a mode of action, remember the most data-intensive approach, be developed to support reliance on in vitro findings related to toxic effects? So this was changed to well, there's first the exact question, and then they added, do you agree that information regarding a shared mode of action or a converged adverse outcome pathway is the gold standard for informing grouping of purpose? So they added this expression, the gold standard, mode of action is the gold standard. And of course, they used that in the paper. So there is one big passage where they state that information is the gold standard critically necessary for grouping of PFAS for the purpose of human health risk assessment. Okay, so this is the first problem of the formulation of the question, but it's also like a mislead quotation. So in the paper, it said that one panelist cautioned that even this application of the P-sufficient approach is highly uncertain and may result in the exclusion of innocuous compounds whose economic importance may be fairly high. Well, this quotation is not connected with the P-sufficient approach and was not done in answer to the question 2.9, but to question 1.2. And there, the expert was talking about the total fluorine approach. So he was discussing the total fluorine approach, and imagine of risk could be accomplished on class by class, group by group. I can imagine that managed as a single class group may exclude from use some fairly innocuous compounds whose economic importance may be fairly high. So they took one answer from the beginning of from another questions, and they used here. And also there is a problem with how this question was framed. So differently than other questions that had multiple choice answers, this one didn't have. So this makes it harder to evaluate the answers. We have only each expert's discursive answer. So it's hard to tell how it was generally not supported. What they mean by generally, they didn't define those crucial aggregating terms. And when I was analyzing the material, I found like 5 experts against the P-sufficient approach, and then 3 in favor, but well, they stated that also more refining was needed to use it. So it's a qualified yes, maybe, and 2 clearly in favor. One of them just related the P-sufficient approach with green chemistry. So it's not explicit which was his position. So it's really hard to tell how it was generally not supported, okay? So these are the problems with the first thesis against the P-sufficient approach, one of the most precautionary one. And going to the second thesis that I investigated has to do with the total fluorine approach. So most panelists agree that it's inappropriate to assume equal toxicity potency across the diverse class of PFAS. So remember that according to the total organofluorine approach, one gets the amount, the concentration of fluorine, and then in order to use for a risk assessment, it assumes that the concentration of the fluorine is equal to a most toxic PFAS, such as PFOA. So that's why they presented that way. So here again, we have a different way of framing the original question. We had some false affirmations and problem with consensus, which kind of consensus this exercise could get. So this is the original question. I'm not going to read it again, just one sec. So I'm just going to mention, so total adsorbable and extractable organofluorine is the 2 methods that can be used to extract fluorine, is equal to the concentration of an old toxic PFAS. So this is the original question at page 47. And here's the question, how it was presented to experts. So we have the first part, which is almost equal, except that it's almost equal. And then they added, what's the scientific merit of such approach again? If the results suggest a concentration greater, what would be the conclusion and next steps? If the results of TOF suggest a concentration less than a PFO-based threshold, then what would be the conclusion and next steps? So they really complicated the questions, add a lot of further steps. So here's the first difference. And here we had multiple choice answer. So here's the material of the supplement material. So here's the question. Here are the results. So 6 were in favor of it and 5 against. So this question results were 6 in favor and 5 against. But the section of the paper was titled "Lack of Consensus Regarding the Use of TOF as an Initial Screening Step." But in the abstract and the press release, they stated that most panelists agreed that it's inappropriate to assume equal toxicity potency across a diverse class of PFAS. So it's really a misleading information. So the answer to the first question, and it's this precise question that is being answered by 6 affirmatively and 5 negatively. So it's interesting to see how they changed that on the abstract and the press release for philosophers of science interested in science communication and press release. I think it's an interesting case to draw the implications of that too. But also, maybe more importantly, from a philosophical point of view, which kind of consensus this kind of exercise could measure, okay? So this kind of exercise could not provide consensus, such as the group states that P, a proposition, represents their position. In this case, in this kind of consensus, one cannot agree with P, but believe that is the position of the group, okay? So this kind of exercise does not allow that. Actually, the consensus, how to frame the agreement among the experts is an inference that maybe the top lead expert made from the material. So it can be more manipulated, okay? So here's the material again. So so this is what I had to talk about the propositions. And in order to going out to the conclusions, I think it's like plausible to say that some choices in the design of the panel, in textual analysis, and the communication of findings were made in an industry-friendly way, affecting 2 grouping approach, the P sufficient and the total organofluorine one. And well, one immediate question that comes after this kind of negative influence of science is, so what to do? Yeah, I see I think one can visualize the kind of solutions that have been proposing in the literature in a continuum, going from like changes which does not affect too much the actual situation of science, going to more extreme changes, such as only publicly funded science. So the first would be disclosure of conflicts of interest. So the journal where this case was published has the policy of non-disclosure of conflicts of interest. And even so, some authors didn't do that. So I think it's not the exact solution that adequates our solution to this kind of influence from the industry. Although it's really important, this paper called my attention because of ACC funding. So I think it's really important. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient to deal with this kind of case. So maybe a stronger measure should be done in order to deal with this. I don't know whether the adequate one would be only publicly funded science. Even James Brown, I think, who proposed that he only restricts his position to biomedical science. So I think it's really hard to change how science is nowadays through a public funded kind of system, of funding system. And even with well, we can discuss that later, but I think a strong measure would be needed. And another question is whether a scientist without conflict of interest should accept the invitation to participate at a panel like the one we investigated. So without knowing that some industry funded the panel, should a scientist without conflicts of interest participate? I think that this case showed that it's somehow a hard decision. So on one hand, he can participate and he or she can participate and try to uncover some industry ploys and this kind of thing, and to share it on social media and to other scientists, to publish letters. So if she thinks that it's the responsibility of science to engage at this kind of exercise and criticize everything that is worrisome, so she should participate, and then it would be maybe valuable. But on the other hand, there is always the chance that your opinions, even if your opinions are reliable and so on, would be co-opted, distorted in a way that favors the industry, and your credibility will be used, as in the paper Kuzas and DeWitt, for example, that have really some positions against some positions of big companies. So their credibility were used in this case. So I think it's really hard whether one should participate or not, therefore. So yeah, so this is what I had to present. Thank you so much for your time, for your patience, and for the reschedule change. And yeah, I think we can discuss now a little bit. So thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Pedro. Great presentation. So now we will shift over to our commentator, Corey DeCheer, who is a postdoc here at the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science, working on issues in philosophy of climate science, philosophy of statistics, and a variety of other issues in philosophy of science. So Corey, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks, Pedro, for this wonderful and very interesting talk. So in my comments today, I'm going to briefly summarize some of Pedro's points, talk about some of the things that I just was thinking about while reading Pedro's paper and listening to Pedro's talk, and end by inviting Pedro to say a little bit more about a couple things that I wanted to hear more about. Okay. So philosophers, historians, and sociologists of science have long recognized the potential dangers of industry influence in the sciences. In the last 2 decades, however, we have become increasingly aware of not just the potential dangers, but the harms that industry influence has actually caused. Most famously, of course, there's pioneering work by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, which identified a series of strategies employed by actors in the tobacco and fossil fuel industries to mislead the public about which conclusions the scientist actually supports, or the science actually supports. And then there's later archival work by Jeffrey, Supran, Oreskes, and others, which documents the extent to which these strategies were carried out intentionally by companies such as ExxonMobil and Shell. Manipulating science is just good business. In his talk today, Bravo draws our attention to a less well-publicized interaction between science and industry, the question of how to group per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, commonly known as PFAS, for regulatory purposes. The problem, broadly speaking, is that some PFAS are known to cause adverse effects in humans, and presumably they cause similar effects to the rest of the ecosystem as well. But the class of PFAS is extremely broad, and the industry has actively resisted painting all PFAS with the same brush. Due to many of the same features that make them harmful to humans, PFAS have a variety of industrial applications, and the industry would like to continue to produce goods that make use of the kinds of PFAS that have not yet been shown to be toxic. As such, the question of how to group PFAS together, i.e. the question of which of the many kinds of PFAS should be grouped with the known to be toxic varieties, is heavily contested. Now, traditionally, the literature on industry influence in the sciences has focused on the beginning and end of the scientific life cycle. Oreskes and Conway's famous study, for example, primarily examines how industry actors spun, censored, and cast doubt on studies once they were completed. Other work in the area, and here I'll just mention one of my favorite papers on the subject by Bennett Holman and Justin Bruner, has examined how industry funding strategies can influence the allocation of academic goods such as prestige, funding, and jobs. Bravo focuses our attention on a different and less well-studied domain, namely the operation of scientific panels. His case study involves a particular panel of experts on PFAS, convened by an online platform called SciPinion, and sponsored, without knowledge of the participants, by a pro-industry trade organization, the American Chemistry Council. As Bravo documents, a variety of decisions made during the organization of the panel and the dissemination of its conclusions serve to promote the industry's preferred narrative, and thus their preferred outcome. One example that he discusses at length is the organizer's interpretation of consensus as meaning something like a view expressed by a plurality of the panelists, an interpretation that allows them to claim that the consensus view of the panel is that PFAS should not be grouped in a more regulation-friendly manner. I note this like interpretation of consensus is obviously not standard in English, but it's also a very consistent move that pro-industry organizations have been making for at least the last 30 years. So Douglas, in her famous inductive risk article from 1999, notes a very similar use of consensus from a study in the early 90s on, on toxic chemicals. Bravo's analysis of this case is interesting for a number of reasons. One is that it highlights just how insufficient it is to disclose potential conflicts of interest at the authorship level. The problem with the panel in the resulting report, which was published in Regulatory Toxicology and Pharmacology, are not limited to conflicts of interest among the authors of the paper. Instead, the problem is that the whole study was shot through with conflicts of interest in a way that shaped the panelists who were invited, the questions that were asked, the analysis of the answers, and etc. Indeed, as Bravo notes, partial disclosure can, and seemingly did in this case, serve to make the report appear more legitimate or trustworthy than it in fact was. At minimum, therefore, Bravo suggests that much more thoroughgoing disclosure policies are required. Allow me to briefly follow this thread a little bit further. One of the central problems in Bravo's case study is the systematic failure of the journal, Regulatory Toxicology and Pharmacology, to abide by norms regarding conflict of interest disclosure. This journal is not alone in this respect, nor is this the only sin that journals commit in this domain. Journals are often reluctant to retract papers and often fail to police standards in other ways, by, for example, allowing papers to be published that rely on or positively cite previously retracted papers. And it's plausible that the situation is only going to get worse as more and more editorial responsibilities are given over to AI. I at least have already heard reports of referee reports that are pretty clearly written by AI or ChatGPT, which is, I think, another way in which journals are not living up to the standards or norms that they should be living up to. Bravo's discussion of this problem suggests a potential intervention for improving the scientific ecosystem, namely the creation of watchdog organizations similar to Retraction Watch or Beall's List that focuses on systematic failures at the journal level. At the very least, it would be interesting to know whether there are journals that are systematically worse than their peers with respect to retractions, conflict of interest failures, and etc. Publishing this information could do a lot of good in helping us determine which information to trust and which information we shouldn't. And to my eyes, at least, the case that Bravo discusses is clearly one where retraction is justified, if for no other reason than that the panelists were misled about the nature of the panel that they were participating in. So organizations that say grade journals on how frequently they publish papers based on this kind of retraction-worthy research would serve as at least a partial bomb in this scenario. Perhaps, however, this kind of ecosystem-level intervention is targeting the wrong problem for this particular case. As noted above, one of the central problems that Bravo highlights is a creative use of the word consensus in describing the conclusions of the authors. One way of avoiding the harm specific to Bravo's case, therefore, would be greater theoretical development and clear disciplinary standards in opinion elicitation. Just as papers in other experimental domains must meet certain experimental standards before publication, papers that rely on opinion elicitation, like the kind that Bravo discusses, should be subject to experimental standards that might include, for example, common or well-theorized interpretation of phrases like consensus. I think that this would just bring into line this kind of research with the other kind of research that involves human subjects, where you are at least supposed to have common or well-theorized interpretation of the measurements that you're using, or the metrics that you're using, at least. I don't, however, have high hopes for this second kind of intervention. The problem here is, for lack of a better term, interdisciplinary. The mistreatment of consensus arises at least in part because the study in question is opinion elicitation study being carried out by people without the relevant expertise. So far as I can tell, none of the 13 authors listed in the paper have a background in psychology, sociology, political science, experimental economics, etc., which means that they are unlikely to have training in carrying out what is essentially an experiment on human subjects like this one. Part of the problem, in other words, is that it's possible to get published in pharmacology journals while carrying out what is essentially sociological research that I feel confident in guessing doesn't meet the standards of actual sociology. It doesn't matter how precisely we refine our standards regarding opinion elicitation, in other words, given the high probability that experts, like chemists, in other fields will simply continue to ignore these standards. In any case, putting aside these suggestions, there are two areas that I would like to invite Bravo to discuss further. First, I'd like to hear more about how he sees the relationship between the industry actions in this case and those that have been documented in prior cases. Returning to Oreskes and Conway, for example, we have well-documented examples of industry actors recruiting sympathetic scientists, selectively publishing or highlighted results, and straightforwardly just lying in their public statements. Where do the actions in this case fit into this picture? Or to put it another way, how does focusing on panels like the one examined here expand our understanding of the ways that industry influences science? What could we fail to understand in neglected cases like this one? Second, I would like to hear more about the moral dilemma that Bravo suggests scientists face when being recruited to take part in panels like the one discussed in this case study. Well, I'm sympathetic to the fact that in this particular case, the scientists in question were unaware that the panel was funded by industry. It seems that where that information is available, or where the scientists might have sufficient reason to suspect that that's the case, there isn't a moral dilemma. It's reasonable to expect scientists to refuse to participate in such cases. Considerations relating to the long-term health of science motivate this conclusion. It seems to me that it would be better to denormalize industry-sponsored panels like the one constructed in Bravo's case study. If such panels are normal, then the failure to disclosure that we find in this case is, just a minor violation of research ethics. But if they're abnormal, and industry sponsorship is widely seen as a reason not to participate in this kind of panel, failing to disclose industry sponsorship will be seen in much more negative light. I'm curious, therefore, why Bravo sees the situation differently, and would love to hear him say more about why he thinks there are good reasons for scientists to participate in such panels in the future. But I'd like to just end by saying, again, I really enjoyed Pedro's paper today, and I think it's a really interesting project and one that deserves more interest and attention from philosophers of science. So thank you again to Pedro for such a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Corey, for those helpful comments. And so now we're going to move into a open time of Q&A, which will begin with Pedro having an opportunity to respond to Corey's comments. And so I'll just highlight to those who are in the webinar, if you would like to ask a question of Pedro about the talk, you can do so in a variety of different ways. You can use the Q&A function. You can raise your hand and I will facilitate you speaking the question directly to Pedro, or you can even send it to us in the chat. Whatever your preference is fine. But let's go ahead and let Pedro begin by responding to Corey's comments just now. So Pedro, will you rejoin us on the video and take the stage again?
Okay, Corey, thank you so much for your work preparing these comments. I'm really thankful for it, and I learned a lot hearing you. So yeah, I'm really happy with your comments. Well, first I would like to say that that I agree with you that having an interdisciplinary interdisciplinary team is not so likely, is it? So I also don't have high hopes for that. I think that interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity is kind of advertised for agencies and so on, university, but when you are applying for a fund, you are criticized for presenting an interdisciplinary project or so. So yeah, I don't have high hopes for that. I think it would be hard to have like a group of chemistries and biologists with sociologists or philosophers like doing this kind of panel, at least doing this kind of panel. Of course, there are interdisciplinary groups with philosophers of science and stuff and so on, but at least invited to this kind of panel, it's less likely. And I agree with you with watchdog organization like Retraction Watch. I think it's a nice step. But I think that because some papers continue to be quoted even after they are retracted, they're kind of information zombies, as I forgot her name. I forgot the name of the philosopher that coined this concept, information zombie, Kelly O'Connor. So some papers are kind of informational zombies. They continue to be spread even if they are dead, they are retracted. I think that because of it, it's a move forward. Yeah, it's a better solution than only disclosure of interest, but maybe would need like more. So I am considering nowadays whether we could like give an analogical argument concerning research funded by the ACC. So even this journal where this paper was published, even this journal, which is really industry friendly, there have been a lot of cases showing that even this journal does not accept papers funded by tobacco companies, because we have a lot of the evidence showing how tobacco industry impacted science in a negative way. So I think we could use like an analogical argument saying that ACC studies are similar to the one that tobacco companies did. So if today there are a lot of journals that forbid accepting papers funded by tobacco companies, why they keep accepting papers funded by the ACC? If they are like similar, there is the similar phenomena. ACC has a long track of manipulation of studies. So yeah, I think it's a harder. I would need like to justify it more, and there is also the problem. So what to do with the money that ACC have? So ACC has. So how to deal with this kind of thing? But I think maybe it's a solution, and also pressing the journal companies as Elsevier, the regulatory, this journal is linked to Elsevier, right? And so this is about the first part of your commentaries. And now going to the questions. So the first one about the relationship between this case and previous one in the literature. So I think that this case is interesting because it's another case where you have like a study that was corrupted, but you have independent scientists, you have like scientists who are even against the industry. So it illustrates how independent scientists' opinions or research can be manipulated. Okay, because I think in the media, or for instance, so 1 month ago, David Michael's books was translated into Portuguese, The Triumph of the Doubt. And in the preface, the translator stated that bad scientists affiliated with the industry manipulates evidence. So I think there is this overspread image that corrupted science funded by industry necessarily involves bad science and who are, who have epistemic biases, who wants to conceal evidence and so on. But as the paper that you mentioned by Holman Brunner shows, in this case too, even independent science can be impacted by industry funding. So actually there's, I guess, another paper by Holman where he shows that since it was because the position of some scientists at public universities that industry started to fund them. So because they use like friendly methodological approach, but they were using that independently of industry. But then industry went there and, so I will start to fund your research, to give you more money and to amplify your research. So the research was not biased, it was not corrupted in an epistemic way, let's put it like that. But even so, it was impacted. The whole literature was impacted. So I think in this case is also another one where you have like independent science also being affected. And I think it's important to have this in mind. It's not only bad science, corrupt scientists who are impacting science in a negative way. And also the second point is that here we can access the details about how the panel was affected, how it was impacted. So we can like see the changes in the questions. So it's a nice example, it's a nice case to investigate how a panel can be impacted by industry. While in other cases, there's one that Rasks mentions, a federal panel whose final report was changed with adjectives, with lighter adjectives, trying to downplay the risks of climate change, I guess. Yeah. And but no one knows exactly who did that, how it was done. Maybe it was done, I don't remember the dates exactly, but between the final draft and the publication, it's plausible to say that it was one of the guys, but they don't have too much evidence about that. And in this case, we can like see the supplementary material, see the changes. So I think it's a nice case because of it. Yeah. And now your second question about the moral dilemma. So I think there is two situations when you don't have the information that industry is funding. So you think you are being invited by some enterprise as an opinion. So it may be you may have like a suspicion, how to say, I forgot the word, I'm sorry. You may suspect that, but like you don't know whether there is really an industry funding. At Saipino websites, they say that they work it with the EPA too. So you make it, maybe it's someone, it's a public department who is funding that. I don't know. So I think maybe in this situation there is still the moral dilemma. Maybe you are entering into something where your opinions will be co-opted, but you also have the chance, some more responsibilities to try to uncover this kind of thing. But in the second situation where this information is available, I totally agree with you. And I didn't consider this criteria that you mentioned. In the long term, it would be bad for science. So I think it's really helpful to think the way you put. So thank you a lot. I think, I totally agree with you. When information is available, I think there is no moral dilemma. A scientist should not participate when she knows that the panel is funded by some company or some big company with a lot of resources as ACC. So I totally agree that then it would be better to not to participate, and eventually this kind of panel diminish, cease to exist. And thank you for your questions. I hope I answered them, but if I not, please please let me know. And I'm sorry for my accent for you all. If I said something wrongly, please do not hesitate to correct me or to ask for something.
Yeah, don't worry about it, Pedro. You're doing great. So let's open things up then for other questions. So Pedro, you can stay on the camera while we sort of see, are there other questions from those attending the webinar that you would like to ask Pedro about his presentation? Just to see, you can either use the raise hand function or you can add it in the Q&A tab on your toolbar, or you can also send it to us as a chat. So maybe I will start with one question that came to mind for me, which was in thinking about Corey's comment about the interdisciplinarity in the panel. I wondered if you were to give a chemist the sort of ramifying families of PFAS chemicals, would they be able to make a judgment about how to group them independent of toxicity, so that there would be a kind of at least a baseline for what a chemist would think in terms of grouping the PFASs in different ways? So in this sense, the idea would be that these are not, they're not grouping based on toxic effects. They're just, chemists who know the chemical nature of these species, and they would say, based on my background knowledge, I would group them this way. And then that could potentially be used within the panel discussion. Do you think that's possible or plausible?
I did not understand that well. Could you repeat, please, your question? There was a lag.
Okay, sorry. So the concern is that for all of those different species of PFAS chemicals that you showed, is it the case that somebody who's a chemist but independent of the concern about toxicology, would they be able to offer a kind of independent grouping that could serve as a reference point for the panel when they're deliberating?
I see. Yeah, it's a hard question. Would a chemistry give like a grouping approach regardless of toxicity profiles and this kind of information?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not sure about it. I would need to think more. But I think it's at least possible. I mean, I don't remember the exact background of each expert in this panel, but I think it depends on how precautionary each chemistry is. So chemistry affiliated with green chemistry principles. So let's produce only substance that can degrade and this kind of thing, and who prefer to overestimate a risk than underestimate. I think that this chemical could provide a group approach regardless of toxicity. But I think that for the discussions about the aggregating terms, so in order to analyze the results of the panel, whether it was most of the scientists, it was generally not supported, there was a consensus or not. This, I think it's harder to do if you are not in an interdisciplinary group. So if there were only people, chemical experts, I think this kind of exercise may be harder, but to provide a grouping approach regardless of toxicity, I think it's plausible. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then I had one other question, which was about the parallels between your case and a very different context in medicine, where there have traditionally been things called consensus conferences that they're not identical to what you were describing, but they have had similar sorts of criticisms made about them in terms of how well they function, whether or not they can be biased by certain kinds of industry funding. But one of the things that I was curious about in bringing up this parallel is that a lot of these consensus conferences have gone away, in part because they're really expensive to do. And so it seems like we could be in a position, whether it's these toxicology assessments or trying to do standardized healthcare treatment assessments, that if we don't have the industry funding, the likely result might be that the panel doesn't meet at all. that if you meet under the auspices of industry funding, but if you don't have the industry funding, you just don't meet. And then, of course, that would not necessarily be a good outcome either. So I'm curious to hear what you think about that, given that it seems like it might be a similar dynamic in other areas.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. So consensus conference, those conferences where citizens are invited as well, like, and
it depends. Sometimes
okay.
it's just physicians.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a really interesting point, because it shows that like changing to immediately to a public funded system is will have like some worrisome consequence. So I guess it's Martin Carrier, the philosopher of science as well, who states that for some research, either it's industry funded or it doesn't happen at all. So I think that some solutions to this kind of impact of industry should try like to use this money. So one of the solutions that I guess Kevin proposed that in a letter, Kevin and Lusk, I guess, they stated that at the OECD, industry companies and pharmaceuticals could like give money to the OECD, the money that they use for research, and then the OECD would like have some group of scientists to decide where the research would be done. So I think it's I think this kind of solution also has its drawbacks, but I think it's yeah, it's a more adequate solution than not to have industry funded at all. Also because it's not industry that are not all industry influence that is problematic, and also because of this case. So if you don't have like the money from industry, so this kind of conference would not happen. So what to do? So we don't have like these meetings, these reports. Yeah, so I think, well, at least in my personal opinion, I think an adequate way forward would be to use this money in in a more non-problematic way, like trying to forbid like some inside agreements with contract research organization or this kind of thing. Yeah, I think it would. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. So let me ask again, are there any questions that people from the audience would like to ask? Well, if not, then I think we can bring things to a close. And so let me say a big thank you to Pedro for joining us today and giving a great presentation, and also to Corey for the comments that he was able to provide. It was definitely a fruitful conversation. This concludes our season of the International Postdoc Forum for the Philosophy of Science. And so we will return in the fall with a new lineup of individuals and commentators. And until then, we wish everyone the best. Take care, be safe, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.